Hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of Coffee Break. It's Steve Barrett here, the editorial director of PR Week, and I'm here with Jeff Smokler, who is a partner at Imre and has just celebrated his 10th anniversary at the agency. So congratulations, Jeff, and welcome to Coffee Break.
Thanks, Steve. 10 years. I didn't know I'd be anywhere that long. Good to see you this morning.
Hey, you got to celebrate longevity these days, haven't you? Because nobody knows what's around the corner.
Yeah, true.
Now, you've just sort of expanded your role at Imre. You were president of Imre Health, but tell us about the new role and a little bit about what Imre does. You're based in Baltimore, I think.
I am based in Baltimore, although we have 4 offices. We're in Manhattan, we're in Los Angeles, we're in Philadelphia, and here in Baltimore. And we work from home across about 20 other states right now in the last 2 years. So yeah, I've been at Imre for 10 years now, as you said. I was hired 10 years ago to help build a healthcare practice. Several years into that, we stood up Imre Health as a division of Imre because we quickly were finding great success in our growth in healthcare. And when I started, consumer was the lion's share of our revenue. And today we sit in a position where more than 80% of our revenue is in healthcare as an agency. So in the last year, we hired a new president of Imre Health, a really talented woman named Anna Kotis, who joined us from Havas H4B Chelsea. And so Anna is overseeing and running the day-to-day Imre Health division of Imre. And that affords me the opportunity to continue to guide Imre Health, but also to guide all of our client business across consumer and healthcare, focusing both on our existing clients as well as new business and agency marketing.
Now, obviously, healthcare has been top of everybody's mind the last couple of years, and it's been part of the growth of PR generally. PR has really stepped up. So tell us some of the trends you've seen, especially in the last couple of years, that have really come to the surface as everybody deals with COVID and vaccines and getting back to whatever the next new normal is. And really, every issue now, or communications issue, has got some sort of a public health lens involved in it, hasn't it?
Well, it really does. It's interesting that you say that because, one of the trends that we're seeing, and that leans into what you're talking about, is that there's more interest among our life sciences, big biotech, pharma clients to help redefine the definition of PR. Things that might have previously been thought of in the marketing silo versus the PR silo. We see those silos coming together much more. If you think about the historic structure of these large pharmaceutical companies, you got PR happening in the corporate affairs division, you've got marketing happening at the brand level. And we're working with clients to bring those two together in different ways. And frankly, I think that the COVID pandemic and, the last 2 years of this wild ride everybody's been on has expedited that. We're working for a client now in the consumer healthcare space, in the eye care, in the ophthalmology space. And, part of our approach to developing an earned media program for those kinds of clients is to think of something we call storyscaping, which is really just the marriage of what's the brand story with what's happening in the landscape. So storyscaping. And because we do that, there isn't a program that we're creating that doesn't somehow touch on the environment today and the COVID pandemic and how that's changing behaviors, changing both patient behaviors as well as prescriber behaviors, changing consumer behaviors. So clearly that is a trend that we're seeing. I also think, as it relates to healthcare specifically, historically, there's also been this separation between unbranded and branded programming. How much do you put the brand's name on it? How much of it is, under the guise of
branded content? Yes.
Yeah, exactly. And I think what we're seeing more of now is bringing unbranded and branded together in new and exciting ways, and not thinking necessarily of the two as parallel paths, but instead thinking them as like an intertwined roadway.
What are the regulatory implications of that? Because it makes a lot of sense, but obviously you're often working in very highly regulated industries, aren't you? Pharmaceuticals, etc.
Absolutely. And you have to understand, and you have to appreciate the importance of the regulatory guardrails. That said, I think everybody has the mindset that it's harder to do anything in pharma because of the regulatory environment. What we have found that if you're smart about how you bring along your reviewers in an organization, so you've got your clients and your clients have to present things to their medical legal review teams. If you can start bringing the medical legal review folks along from the conception of an idea through the execution, it's easier to work in a way that makes everybody feel that you're being respectful of those regulatory guardrails. It's harder if you bake an entire program and then bring something to a regulatory review panel who has very little context. And frankly, Steve, we're even seeing that we need to bring technology to the regulatory process. So if we're proposing, I mean, we do a lot of digital and social media for life sciences brands. If we're proposing, TikTok for a pharmaceutical brand, that's a whole new realm for most of our medical legal reviewers. And so we'll do live reviews. We'll send iPads and iPhones to the review team and do practice run-throughs of our live reviews where we'll show them the technology. We'll walk them through how ISI comes to life in those different kinds of modalities and really bring them along for the journey. So certainly regulatory concerns are a primary part of the strategic and conceptualization of our ideas, but not an inhibitor.
Yeah, it's just something you've got to navigate. You mentioned TikTok there. The younger generations obviously engage with health issues in a very different way, and the way everybody is engaging is different. They're taking more control. They're using the internet, which has got positive and negative connotations. But how is that going to change healthcare generally and the way healthcare brands are communicating? Because people, they want more control. They want, diverse audiences need to be taken into account a lot more than they have been. So talk us through that a little bit.
Yeah, that's a really great point. And that is kind of how we're viewing PR right now, or earned and influencer PR through life sciences lens. It's how do we build influencer programs on in channels where patients and HCPs and others are using. So, one of the ways to do that is to find physicians, clinicians, others who are expert in their field, who enjoy being on social media, who have their own followings before we reach out to them. We just launched a HCP TikTok program for a cancer drug that we work with. And we have an actual oncologist who has more than 40,000 followers on his Instagram channel, explaining in very basic terms, not scientific terms, basic terms, what that type of cancer does and why their treatment is advancing the way in which we treat cancer. And it's, just so interesting to watch oncologists speak to their own peers, because a lot of the folks who follow physicians on their social channels are other physicians. These are becoming, the face of KOLs is changing and how we use them. So that's one example. The other thing, and it gets more to the heart of your question, is we need to change and educate the way social media platforms allow healthcare brands to use their platforms. And we had a huge success recently. Our VP of social was working with TikTok, and TikTok had some very specific regulations, and there's certain content they won't allow in their platforms. There's actually certain disease states they won't even allow talked about because they feel like there's mature content, like HIV, for instance. We work in the HIV space. We work in the women's sexual health space. And, to someone who is not a healthcare thought leader, but perhaps a tech platform, they don't understand the nuances of that audience. They don't understand the nuances of how you speak to those folks. So rather than try to understand them, they typically just put a no can do policy across the board. Just last week, our VP of social, after weeks of working with TikTok, was able to get an actual policy change from TikTok to allow for certain kinds of content. So it's about connecting the dots for some of those platforms, making sure that we have the speakers, making sure that we have the influencers who have interesting things to say, making sure that we find people who have their own audiences built already, and then greasing the skids on the back end, making sure that the technology platforms understand the value in giving those people a voice. So that's kind of how we're approaching that.
Yeah, because these are global platforms, aren't they? And healthcare and pharma has obviously got very different regional rules and regs. So you've got to be aware of that. They're still getting used to it, aren't they? What are your reflections on? Clearly, nobody ever thought we could get vaccines produced and into market so quickly. How has healthcare generally and pharma changed because of COVID and because of what's happened and how the industry has stepped up? And clearly there's a whole issue around misinformation, disinformation around the vaccines. Got quite febrile debates in the country and globally about about how this is playing out. What's your reflections on that? It's been sometimes you forget we're all in the middle of this, aren't we? And we're going so quickly, but sometimes you're like, wow, we got vaccines done in this, really short space of time.
Absolutely. I think, if anything, Steve, I think the biggest trend is that, and maybe one of the silver linings of the pandemic is that for the first time, and as long as I can remember in my 20 plus career working as a healthcare communicator, the life sciences industry has some reputational capital that it never had before. When did people talk about Pfizer? When did people talk about Moderna? I mean, those are words that people just, everyday people just pop off the top of their heads now. And there's recognition now of, oh, that's what a pharma company does. They research and develop life-saving, life-altering, changing drugs and bring it to market in record speed. For the last 20 years, pharma has had to defend its R&D budgets, why they invest so much. And there's been very little public recognition of the value of pharma companies. I see that changing. And my hope is that life sciences companies will leverage that reputational capital they have now, not retreat, and instead do more of that, put their brands out there more and show where they're contributing to the greater good. And I think you're seeing that from some of those companies that have already gotten some recognition for their vaccines. Separate from that, if I could just add, Steve, I think that there's certainly been changes in pharma marketing as a result of the pandemic, specifically in the healthcare professional marketplace. And this isn't news to you, but obviously, it's if folks aren't having conferences and congresses where HCPs typically get together, if personal promotion is no longer allowed and reps aren't able to go into doctors' offices, the reliance on digital platforms has never been so great. At Imre, we were lucky because we were already working in digital long before. I mean, a lot of our HCP programming was about virtual engagement, virtual personal promotion, and non-personal promotion. And then on the patient side, unfortunately, I think what we're seeing is that some of the brands we work with are not selling as many of their products because patients aren't seeing doctors. I heard something from someone yesterday who works on one of our ovarian cancer drugs, but that there are fewer ovarian cancer diagnoses this year than ever before. And that's not because suddenly fewer women have ovarian cancer. It's because those women aren't seeing their doctors. And so that's a real concern, not just because folks want to sell medication, but because we've got, sick people out there who don't know they're sick.
That's a good point, and a very, very good point. You mentioned HIV earlier. We've made great strides on that. When are we going to get a cure for cancers? When are we going to make more progress on that? Because that's still like the biggest killer, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it is. I wish I had a magic 8 ball and I could tell you. But what I would say,
a bit of a big question, that, to be honest.
But what I would say is that the number one, the therapeutic area where the pipeline is the biggest, and this is from any of the research you'll read from any of the consulting firms, is oncology. So there is a plethora of new drugs coming up in the pipeline across multiple different areas in oncology. Also, precision medicine is taking hold, meaning that the amount of funding being spent on understanding the way one particular cancer happens is bigger than it's ever been before. So I'm optimistic that we're making progress in the fight against cancer by virtue of the fact that so many of the world's most brilliant minds are focused on oncology. I'd like a cure for HIV too, I should say.
Absolutely, yeah.
And I've been amazed at the way companies working in that space have brought to market medications and frankly, public health and education programs that are changing the game.
Yeah, it feels like we've made progress after actually quite a lot of years of inactivity on that.
Yes, absolutely. I agree.
Just to finish, Jeff, you've worked at Weber Shandwick, you worked at Blue Cross Blue Shield back in the day, and you were a speechwriter, and that is a very specialized skill. We don't talk about it that much, but really specialized skill. Just to finish the coffee break, what's your top tips for writing a great speech and being a good speech writer? Because it's a very specialized skill.
It is, and it's one that I love. Top tips, I would say, never forget you're not writing for yourself. Always have the person for whom you're writing's voice in your head, because what I'm going to say to an audience is different than what someone else is going to say and the way I say it. So I'd say never lose sight of that. I would say research. Before you sit down to write any speech, do research the audience, research the topic, even look at old jokes and comics and find culturally relevant ways to hit home on your message more. Because, you know, you and I have sat in audiences, we've heard executives or policymakers give speeches, and there's nothing worse than feeling like you're just being spoken to.
Terrible,
and,
isn't
you
it?
know, exactly, and just being, you know, inundated with a message that doesn't necessarily relate to your life. So the more you can do to provide contextualization and cultural relevancy, I think, and levity. I think too often executives and legislators and policymakers feel like adding levity to their speeches makes them look overly vulnerable or perhaps not as professional. But I'm a big believer in levity being a connective tissue for everybody in a room.
Yeah, although you shouldn't try and be a comedian if you're not. I've learned.
Not a comedian. I'm not a comedian.
All right, Jeff, great to catch up, and thanks for joining us on Coffee Break. Really enjoyed it.
Thanks for the invitation, Steve. Have a good day.